The business class cabin shimmered with soft light, creating the illusion of coziness at 10,000 meters. Lisa Watson, an experienced flight attendant with 9 years of experience, was used to the refined manners of passengers in this class. But that night, her attention was drawn to the man in Seat 2A, Elon Musk. The owner of multiple companies looked tired, his eyes fixed on a tablet with endless graphs and charts. The flight seemed to be routine until Musk had a problem. He accidentally spilled a glass of water on his papers and tablet. Lisa reacted instantly, handing him napkins and offering to bring him a new drink. "Thank you," he threw shortly, trying to wipe the water off the screen. Lisa noticed he was annoyed. She returned a few minutes later with a cup of hot tea. It was a slight breach of protocol. Tea was served later on the menu, but Lisa felt that in Musk's situation a small gesture of attention was justified. He glanced at her, interrupted from his business for the first time, and murmured, "It saved me some time. Thank you." Their gazes met for a second, and Lisa smiled. She felt that she had done the right thing in helping a passenger, especially such an important one. But her actions were being watched. The flight manager, Ms. Crawford, a woman with a cold stare and stern approach to her work, was nearby. Her thin nose wrinkled in indignation as she watched Lisa's interaction with Musk. "Watson," she called out later as Lisa walked back toward the kitchen, "what did you just do?" "Helped a passenger, ma'am. He spilled water," Lisa replied calmly. "And decided to ignore protocol? In business class, you're supposed to follow standards, not pay special attention to one passenger." Crawford's tone was icy, but Lisa parried confidently. "I felt it needed to be in the moment." Crawford gave her a scornful look and, without another word, withdrew. However, things escalated when the plane landed. In the crew lounge area, Lisa confronted Crawford again. Her manager was already talking to an airline representative, discussing Lisa's actions. "Watson made a nuisance of herself," said Crawford. "Do you know who was on board? If anything goes wrong, we'll be blamed." Lisa couldn't understand where this resentment was coming from. Just a cup of tea and a bit of politeness. What could be so wrong with that? But it had become a boiling point for management. Elon Musk had his rules, and company protocol had its own. Lisa unwittingly found herself at the center of the conflict. A few hours later, in the shadow of the terminal, Lisa was summoned to speak with the company manager. She didn't know yet that this day would be the beginning of her biggest nightmare. The crew waiting area was oppressively empty, as if the atmosphere itself foreboded an impending storm. Lisa sat in a hard chair, her hands nervously rubbing a thin file folder. She had been summoned to discuss the incident. The term seemed strange to her. There had been no incident, or so she thought. The office door swung open and she was beckoned to enter. Inside, she was greeted by 3 people: Ms. Crawford, the flight manager, the human resources representative, and Mr. Gray, the disciplinary officer. Lisa immediately noticed their cold stares and the restrained tension in their voices. "Lisa," Mr. Gray began, setting aside his pen and looking at her through his massive glasses. "We've gathered some data about your behavior on the last flight. Tell us what happened." She began, confidently, talking about helping Elon Musk, as indeed she had. But her words were interrupted by Ms. Crawford, who cut in with remarks. "You went against protocol. That's unacceptable. You singled out one passenger. That's unequal treatment." Lisa tried to explain that her actions were dictated by human kindness, but she soon realized that the conversation was more like an interrogation. Crawford's remarks became increasingly harsh. Did you ever think that your actions might have given the wrong impression? Your role is to serve everyone, not ingratiate yourself with famous customers. But it wasn't just the mask. Lisa began to notice that the atmosphere was becoming more and more personal. "We've noticed repeatedly that you're too emotional," Crawford said coldly. "It may have something to do with your temperament." The word temperament sounded like a code, but Lisa took the hint perfectly. Her voice shook, but she answered, "Excuse me, ma'am. What do you mean?" Crawford smiled slightly with the corner of her lips, clearly pleased with the reaction. "It's just that sometimes you need to control your emotions better. It's an important trait of a professional." Lisa felt anger and resentment rising in her chest. She had seen other stewardesses forgive minor infractions, but now she realized she was being judged by a different standard. Her skin color, her background, had become an invisible factor that outweighed her professionalism. The conversation continued in the same vein until finally Mr. Gray drew the line. "Lisa, we're suspending you from flying, pending an internal investigation. It's not a punishment, but we need to make sure this kind of situation doesn't happen again." Her breath caught. A temporary suspension. It could mean anything. She knew that many employees lost their jobs in situations like this, even if they weren't initially proven guilty. "It's not fair," she whispered. "I only did what I thought was right." Crawford pressed her lips together as if satisfied with victory. "Perhaps you overestimate your understanding of the rules, Lisa. In this company, it's not just about the job. It's about conforming to the company values." When Lisa left the office, she felt crushed. But the worst was ahead. Within hours, rumors began to spread in employee chats about a troubled flight attendant who broke the rules for attention. Comments slipped into the messages, which Lisa read with a clenched heart. They never understand how to behave in such conditions. They always cause problems. Those "such" sounded particularly loud. She couldn't help but notice that more and more often her actions were associated not with her professionalism, but with her background. Lisa didn't sleep that night. She stared at the ceiling of her tiny apartment, realizing that her life was slowly but inexorably slipping into the abyss. She had a feeling that this was only the beginning. The silence in the meeting room was heavy and pressing, like a thick fog. Lisa entered the room with a belated sense of hope. She had been summoned to formally discuss the results of the temporary investigation. Upon entering, however, she immediately realized that the meeting was not for her, but against her. At the long table sat several airline executives, including Ms. Crawford. To her left were Lisa's co-workers, part of the team she'd worked with on that very flight. Their gazes avoided her, as if the touch of her presence was scalding. "Lisa Watson, sit down." The voice of Mr. Gray, who led the meeting, sounded emotionless, almost mechanical. She crouched down carefully, feeling all eyes on her back. Her heart was pounding so hard she thought she could hear it in the silence. "After a thorough review of the events that occurred on your last flight, we have concluded that your behavior was inappropriate for our corporate standard," Gray began. "You violated protocol, inconveniencing other passengers and jeopardizing the company's reputation." Lisa opened her mouth to object, but his gaze stopped her. His words were like a sentence. "My behavior?" she said in a barely audible voice. "All I did was my job. I helped a passenger." Crawford interrupted her with an unpleasant smile. "Assistance is one thing, but special treatment of a single passenger, especially one of that status, raises questions. You made us look unequal. It created a risk." The word risk sounded like a double-edged blade leaving an invisible wound. But there was a deeper implication behind the word that Lisa couldn't ignore. The colleagues around the table nodded like puppets, echoing Crawford's words. Risk? Lisa decided to speak up for the first time. "I did what any other stewardess in my position would have done. Why are you doing this to me?" Crawford squinted, her voice drenched in venom. "Maybe because you've always been, well, a little different." That statement hung in the air like a dagger. Several of Lisa's co-workers tensed, but no one said a word. Lisa felt resentment and pain rising inside her. She had always been praised for her diligence, for her attentiveness to her passengers. Why had all of that turned into a weapon against her now? "Are you referring to my skin color?" she asked coldly, her voice hard. Gray raised his hand to stop the escalation. "Let's leave emotion at the door. We're not talking about your background, Lisa. We're talking about your behavior and your lack of standards." But everyone knew what it was really about. Lisa could see it in the expressions on her colleagues' faces, detached, avoiding her gaze. She felt isolated, alone in front of the entire machine of the corporate system. "So," Gray continued, "the board has reached a decision. Your contract will be terminated immediately. We thank you for your years of service, but your continued employment with the company is impossible." Those words sounded like a blow to the chest. The room seemed to shrink around her. Lisa could only sit there, hearing her world crumble. "It's not fair," she whispered, but her voice sank in the cold formality of the decision. Gray stood up and placed the document in front of her, requiring her signature. She stared at the paper for a long time, looking for some loophole in it. At that moment, Miss Crawford, rising, cast her one last disparaging glance. "Perhaps you'll find it easier in a different environment, Lisa," she said, emphasizing the hidden subtext again. As Lisa left the room, she felt the weight of her colleagues' gazes pressing down on her. No one said a word in her defense, no one offered support. She walked past them like a ghost, invisible and unwanted. On the way back home, her phone vibrated. Messages and calls from former coworkers had already started pouring in. Some were sympathetic, but most were permeated with mockery and snide remarks. In one of them, she read, "Well, you knew it would happen sooner or later." Lisa sat on the bus, clutching her phone in her hand, tears in her eyes. Her career, her dream, everything she had devoted years to had been destroyed in an instant. But, along with the bitterness, anger began to rise in her soul. Anger at the system, at the people who had allowed this to happen, and at the world that had always put her a step below. The days after the dismissal merged into one endless, agonizing wait for the worst to happen. Lisa tried not to check her phone, but the messages kept coming, like drops of poison seeping into her life. She deleted her social media profiles, but it was too late. Her name popped up on several popular blogs about corporate ethics, where her case was cited as an example of unscrupulous behavior. One of the bloggers, discussing the situation, emphasized that Lisa allegedly broke the professional distance for the sake of attention to herself. But among the accusations, there were also dirtier innuendos. One comment in particular stuck with her. "Well, of course it's always the same. They come in thinking the rules don't matter to them." Her heart clenched. It wasn't just a hint. It was a direct blow to her identity. There were more and more comments like that, spreading like weeds. People who had never known Lisa descended upon her with a wave of hatred. The words, "people like her," were in every other post. She couldn't understand how her small act turned into such a public outcry, but everything became clear when her case was picked up by several news channels, which enjoyed savoring the name of Elon Musk. One story mentioned a young flight attendant who tried to use the famous billionaire's position to her advantage. The reporter spoke with unemotional confidence, but each phrase sounded like a hammer blow. Rumors began to spread among her former colleagues. Those who had once smiled at her on flights were now texting each other in corporate chat rooms. She always stood out, acted like she was allowed to do anything. I always knew she'd cause trouble, too much ambition for, Lisa felt the walls around her shrinking. Every call from friends or former coworkers was drenched in distrust, or worse, pity. One of her close work friends, Julie, called to comfort her, but the conversation was even more painful. "Lisa, you have to understand that all these rumors, people just like to stir things up, but maybe you should have been more discreet." Julie spoke softly, but her words stung like acid. Restrained? Lisa couldn't believe his ears. "I did my job, that's all." "Yes, but you realize how it looks to them," Julie replied evasively. "There's always been a certain order in our company, and you've always been a little bright." Bright. The word sounded like a punch in the face. She realized it was a veiled form of saying, "too conspicuous for someone like you." Over time, her sense of isolation became all-consuming. She was afraid to go outside for fear that someone would recognize her face from the news. Graffiti appeared on walls in her neighborhood that seemed to be aimed directly at her. They always break the rules. Lisa knew it wasn't a coincidence. It was a reflection of the hatred she felt through her phone screen. At night, she could hear her neighbors whispering behind the walls. Her name was mentioned more and more often, and these were not words of encouragement. Lisa felt ostracized not only from her profession, but also from her life. She was finally thrown off balance by the letter that arrived in the mail. Inside was a piece of paper with a blurry photo of her worst moment as she walked out of the airline office after being fired. Beneath the photo was a caption, "You never belonged where you were trying to be." She felt a chill run down her back. It was personal. Someone was watching her. Someone wanted her to know that her life now belonged to this scandal. All this time, Lisa had been trying to maintain her dignity, but this blow had been too much. She began to wonder if she deserved such hatred. Her action, her smile to Elon Musk, now seemed like the biggest mistake of her life. But deep down, she knew. It wasn't just her actions, it was who she was. Her skin color, her background, her confidence, all of it had become a weapon against her. Lisa closed all the windows and doors in her apartment, pulled down the curtains, and turned off the lights. She sat in the dark, feeling fear become her only companion. The world outside her door was cold and cruel, and Lisa began to realize that this nightmare was far from over. Lisa sat on the edge of her bed, staring at a single point on the wall. It had been a few weeks since she'd been fired, but the sense of reality was distant. Every day was like another. Sleepless nights, feelings of helplessness, and the slow, exhausting fear of tomorrow. Her financial situation was getting worse, and the thoughts that had once helped her fight now seemed useless. Everything she had built had crumbled, and now she felt like she was hanging on the edge of a precipice. Every morning began with a hard stare at her phone screen. Her email was overflowing. Rent bills, utility bills, and reminders of payments she could no longer afford. Sometimes she opened those emails, but more often she just stared at them, unable to find the energy to even read through to the end. The career she had spent years building had been destroyed, and now it seemed impossible to find a new job. Lisa sent resumes to dozens of companies, but no one responded. The case of her dismissal kept coming up in job interviews. Employers asked questions she couldn't explain without the threat of a new wave of condemnation. When the money ran out, she started selling her things. First, it was jewelry her parents had given her, then designer clothes bought with her salary that she was proud of. But even that couldn't cover her growing expenses. Lisa called her parents for the first time in years to ask for help. Their disappointed voices only added to her guilt. She heard her father quietly tell her mother, "I warned her that in a world like this, it's best to keep a low profile." Those words echoed in her head. The social pressure did not abate. Sometimes she went out to buy groceries, but every time she felt the stares of passers-by. She felt like they recognized her, even if it wasn't true. Her paranoia grew, and with it, her fear of the open world. One day, at the supermarket checkout, the cashier, a girl in her 20s, looked at her and whispered quietly, "You're the one, aren't you?" Lisa froze, not knowing what to say. The girl didn't say anything else, but her gaze was full of judgment. At home, Lisa could no longer find peace. The internet kept reminding her of her failure. Someone created a fake account to post insults and false stories about her. She was called manipulative, lazy, using her skin color to get ahead. Lisa tried to ignore it, but even deleting the accounts didn't help. The news and rumors kept spreading. She read things about herself that undermined her self-esteem, making her doubt every detail of her life. The worst part was that Lisa was beginning to believe these accusations. Maybe I really did something wrong. Maybe I really was overconfident. These thoughts had become habitual for her. Her confidence that had once helped her cope with difficulties had vanished without a trace. Every day was filled with fear of the unknown, fear of losing her home, fear of being on the street, fear that she would never be able to rebuild her life. One evening, sitting in the darkness of her apartment, Lisa heard a knock on the door. She froze, her heart beginning to race. No one was supposed to come. She slowly walked over to the peephole and looked. No one. But there was a piece of paper on the mat in front of the door. She cautiously opened the door, looked around, and picked up the note. It said, "You can't run away from who you are." Her hands trembled and a cold sweat ran down her back. She felt like this nightmare would never end. The world that had once seemed fair to her was now a trap. She tried to find the strength to fight, but everything around her, the social stigma, the racist innuendo, the indifference of her employers, pushed her over the edge. The hopelessness grew deeper and deeper, and the only thought that kept her from falling completely was a quiet but desperate whisper. "This isn't the end. You have to find a way to survive." Lisa spent another sleepless night flipping through articles and comments that made her name a symbol of failure and public scorn. But amidst all the filth, she began to notice something else. Other stories. On social media, small blogs, and anonymous forums, stories began to appear of people who had faced similar problems. These were former airline employees, flight attendants, pilots, even maintenance staff. Their stories sounded painfully familiar. One of the stories that stuck with Lisa belonged to a woman named Amara, also a black flight attendant. Amara described how her career was ruined when she tried to complain about her superiors' demeaning behavior. "They said I was too aggressive. Do you know what that means? It means I was black and I wasn't quiet," she wrote. Those words made Lisa feel less alone, but also fueled her anger. Another story belonged to a young Asian woman who lost her job because she refused to honor the personal requests of a powerful passenger. They said the customer is always right. But where are our rights? She asked in her post. Below her post, dozens of comments from other employees confirmed that similar situations had happened in their careers. Lisa began to notice a pattern. These cases were most often minority employees. Blacks, Hispanics, Asians, their careers collapsed under the weight of systemic prejudice. She recalled her first days on the job when some coworkers avoided her, pretending she didn't exist. She recalled caustic remarks about her hair, her accent, how she stood out too much. At the time, she'd thought they were just little things. But now, looking back, she saw how those little things added up to something bigger, a system. Lisa decided to dig deeper. She remembered how Ms. Crawford, her manager, always belittled those who were different. She would find a reason to reprimand even the smallest of things. Lisa remembered how a young Hispanic flight attendant had been fired for allegedly mishandling passengers. But Lisa had seen this young woman at work and knew that her fault was only an excuse. One day, Lisa came across a closed social media group where former airline employees shared their stories. She was added after she wrote a comment under one of the posts. There, she learned about the systemic problems of the industry, how airline rules were used to suppress and humiliate workers, especially those who were minorities. One of the most shocking stories was that of Michael, a young black pilot. He wrote how he was constantly put on less prestigious flights, claiming that he still had to learn. Michael recounted how his fellow white pilots with less experience were given promotion after promotion. "I was told I should be thankful I was allowed to do this job at all," he wrote. These stories began to fit together into a coherent puzzle. The system was designed to protect the privileged and suppress those who might become a threat to the status quo. Racial prejudice, masquerading as corporate standards, allowed companies to get rid of inconvenient employees. Lisa began to realize that her case was not an isolated incident. She was a victim of a system that had long existed in the shadows. Her breach of protocol was just a convenient excuse. She remembered Ms. Crawford's words, "You stand out too much." Now she saw their true meaning. They didn't want to see her succeed. Her presence violated their comfort, their ingrained stereotypes. She decided not to stay silent. Lisa contacted Amara and other people whose stories she had read. Together, they began collecting evidence, documents, records, letters. They created an anonymous forum where airline employees could share their stories without fear of retribution. The forum quickly gained popularity, and soon they began receiving feedback not only from employees but also from journalists interested in covering the problem. Each new story Lisa read filled her with a mixture of anger and determination. She knew it would be a fight she might not win, but she didn't want to be silent anymore. Her dismissal had been a personal tragedy for her, but now it had become a symbol of something bigger. The system that had broken her could no longer remain in the shadows. Lisa decided that her voice would be part of that struggle. She couldn't get back what she had lost, but she could make sure that others didn't go through what she had gone through. That was just the beginning. Lisa sat at her old laptop, browsing social media feeds and posting in anonymous groups. She kept reading new stories of employees who shared their pain, their anger, and their hope. Each of these stories filled her with a strange mixture of despair and strength. But what she didn't expect was that one day A letter would arrive in her inbox that would change everything. It was written succinctly and signed with initials. The subject line read, "You are not alone." At first, Liza thought it was another taunt or threat, but when she read the first lines, she froze. "Lisa, I've been following your story from the beginning. What has happened to you is horrible, and it is more than just an injustice. You are a victim of a system that is long overdue for change. Please contact me. Together, we can do something more. M." She read the letter 3 times, but she never realized who the author was. Doubt tore at her. Could it have been a trap? But something in the tone of the letter seemed sincere. Gathering her courage, she replied. The next day, her phone rang. The number was unknown. "Hello, is this Lisa?" The voice on the other end of the line sounded calm and confident. "My name is Mario Brown. I'm an attorney and labor rights activist. I found out about your story through social media. Why do you want to help me?" Lisa's voice shook with disbelief. "Because your story is not just your pain. It's a problem that thousands of people face, but you have a chance to make a difference. I want to support you. We can go to the media and show everyone how this system works." Lisa hesitated for a moment. She found it hard to believe that anyone, especially a lawyer, could be interested in her situation. But what did she have to lose? She agreed. It took several days before Lisa realized the magnitude of what was happening. Mario not only offered legal assistance, but also connected her with several community organizations working on racial discrimination and labor rights. These organizations began campaigning on her behalf, creating hashtags and publications in support of Lisa. One evening, as she was watching the news, her name suddenly appeared in a story. The reporter was talking about an unfair dismissal and how it had uncovered systemic problems at the airlines. But then, something happened that Lisa had in no way expected. A short video clip appeared on the screen in which Elon Musk said, "I remember that stewardess. She was kind and professional. If her actions were the reason she was fired, that is completely wrong. I would be willing to meet with her and help her deal with the situation." Lisa froze. Her heart was racing. She couldn't believe that Musk, who had unknowingly caused her dismissal, was now willing to support her. The next day, Lisa's phone was ringing off the hook. Journalists, activists, strangers wrote and called to express their support. The campaign, launched by Mario and his team, had grown enormously. Lisa suddenly realized that she was no longer alone. A week later, Mario organized a meeting with a team of lawyers, members of the press, and Lisa. It was the first major event she was to speak at. She was nervous, but Mario put her at ease. "Lisa, just tell your truth. It's important. People need to hear you." When she stood in front of the camera, her voice shook, but there was sincerity in it. "I was fired for doing what I thought was right. But this is no longer just my story. It's the story of everyone who has been victimized by injustice. I want us to stop being silent." Her speech went viral on social media, garnering thousands of views and comments. Some of them were skeptical, but most of them expressed support. Lisa felt heard for the first time in a long time. The next day, she received another unexpected call. It was a representative of a major television show who offered her a chance to perform live on air. Lisa knew it wouldn't be easy, but she agreed. She could no longer back out. Her story was no longer hers alone. She became a voice for those who could never talk about their problems. Mario supported her every step of the way. When Lisa asked why he was so interested in her case, he replied, "Because I was in your shoes once too. But I didn't have anyone to help me. You could be the person who changes the rules." These words seared into Lisa's soul. She realized that her struggle had just begun, but now she felt that she was not alone. There were new challenges ahead of her, but now she had people who believed in her. She didn't know how it would end, but for the first time in a long time she believed that she had a chance to change not only her life, but also the lives of others. News of Lisa's situation reached global proportions, and Elon Musk's name continued to make headlines. Although he himself initially avoided comment, public and media pressure was mounting. Public opinion demanded his position. Was he to blame for Lisa's dismissal? And if not, why was he doing nothing to remedy the situation? Musk soon made a surprise announcement on his Twitter. "I learned about a situation with a flight attendant who was fired for just doing her job. This is unacceptable. If someone is facing something like this, we should support them, not break them down. I want to personally talk to Lisa and hear her story." These words instantly attracted attention. The internet was divided into two camps. Some supported Musk for his initiative. Others considered it an attempt to justify himself. But for Lisa, it came as a shock. Her story suddenly reached a new level, and now the billionaire himself wanted to meet her. Mario, her lawyer, called Lisa the next morning. "Do you realize what this means?" His voice sounded agitated. "Musk has publicly expressed a desire to talk to you. This could completely change the course of events." "But what am I going to tell him?" Lisa was still hesitant. He's part of this whole situation. What if it's just a publicity stunt?" "It could be anything," Mario replied. "But if he really wants to help, it's a chance not to be missed." A few days later, the meeting was organized. Musk sent a private jet to bring Lisa to one of his offices. She was nervous, but Mario calmed her down by accompanying her to the meeting. When they arrived, Lisa felt a mixture of fear and determination. She entered the spacious office where Elon himself was waiting for her. He rose, holding out his hand. "Lisa, it is a pleasure to finally meet you. First, I want to say that I am truly sorry that my situation may have caused you problems." Lisa struggled to hide her emotions. Her voice trembled when she answered. "Thank you for taking the time. But it's not just you. It's the system I've been working in. It destroys people like me." Musk listened to her intently. Lisa told her story, how she lost her job, how she was bullied, how she felt isolated and broken. She talked not only about herself, but also about other people whose stories she had learned over the past weeks. Musk didn't interrupt, and when she finished, sighed. "That's not what's supposed to be happening. I was focused on my business and didn't notice how my actions may have indirectly affected your life. But I can try to fix it." The next day, Musk made several statements that became a sensation. First, he offered Lisa a job at one of his companies. It wasn't just a position. He offered her to be part of a team dedicated to improving corporate culture and eliminating discrimination. "Lisa knows what it means to be victimized by the system," he said in his address. "I want her to help me create a system where this will never happen again." Second, Musk publicly called on the airline that fired Lisa to conduct an internal investigation. He also promised to provide resources for legal support for employees facing discrimination. "Companies must be held accountable for their actions," he said. "We cannot tolerate injustice." These steps caused a storm of emotion. For Lisa, this was more than just help. It was a chance to not only rebuild her life, but to give a voice to those who had been silenced. She agreed to Musk's offer, but with one condition. She wanted her work to actually make a difference. Elon, unexpectedly for Lisa, became interested in her ideas. He listened to her talk about the challenges faced by minorities and what could be done to support them. Together, they began developing a program to educate managers and employees about ethics and inclusion. Musk gave her resources, freedom, and the opportunity to work with leading experts in the field. Lisa has begun a new chapter in her life. Her story, which began as a tragedy, was now a symbol of hope and change. She knew it would be a long journey, but she had people by her side who were willing to fight for justice, and for the first time in a long time, she felt that her voice really mattered. Lisa sat in the crowded courtroom with her pen clutched tightly in her hands. Her gaze was fixed on the table where the airline representatives were sitting. They were dressed in strict suits, their faces emotionless, as if everything that was happening was just another case to be settled. But for Lisa, this was more than just a case. It was her life, her honor, her opportunity to prove to the world that she hadn't given up. The trial began after the lawyers involved in the campaign for her defense had gathered enough evidence. The allegation centered not only on her unfair dismissal, but also on systemic issues of discrimination and bias. Mario Brown, her lawyer and loyal associate, stood by her side, confidently preparing her defense. "Lisa, remember, this is not just about you. It's about everyone who's been affected by this system," he reminded us before the meeting began. "You are not alone." When the hearing began, Lisa heard the airline's official position for the first time. They tried to reduce her termination to a breach of protocol and a professional error, but Mario was ready. He presented documents showing that company rules were often interpreted differently for different employees. He cited data on how other minority employees faced injustice. The evidence included internal records, letters, and even testimony from former employees. One of Lisa's former co-workers, Amara, agreed to testify in court. Her testimony was powerful. "I worked at this company for 6 years, and every day I felt like I needed to prove my worth more than the rest of the company." Lisa was a victim of the same thing. She was talented and kind, but that didn't protect her from a system that always found a way to blame us. Every word resonated with Lisa. Her eyes filled with tears, but she held on, not letting her emotions take over. The media was not left out. Every meeting was covered in the news. The campaign, started by activists, grew, and more people began to support Lisa. On social media, the hashtags number Justice for Lisa and number End Workplace. Bias became trends. People shared their stories, telling how injustice at work had changed their lives. It was more than one woman's struggle. It became a symbol of a movement against systemic oppression. One of the most memorable moments was the public endorsement from Elon Musk. On the day of one of the important hearings, he posted on Twitter, "Justice must be served. We must support those who have been victimized by injustice and make the world a better place." His words drew even more attention to the case, and the airline had to launch an internal investigation. Soon, several high-ranking employees, including Ms. Crawford, were suspended. For Lisa, this process was not only a struggle for justice, but also a journey to find herself. She began to believe in her own strength again. Every day she spent in court strengthened her confidence. She no longer felt like a victim. Now she was a fighter. "Lisa, you've changed," Mario said one day as they were leaving the courtroom. "I remember you as confused and broken. Now I see a strong person who is not afraid to go forward." Lisa smiled, feeling for the first time in a long time that his words were true. After months of hearings, the court handed down its decision. The airline was found guilty of unfair dismissal and discrimination. It had to pay compensation to Lisa, but most importantly, they had to make sweeping changes to their corporate policies. For Lisa, this was more than just a victory. It was confirmation that her struggle had been worthwhile. At a press conference after the trial, Lisa, standing in front of a crowd of reporters, said, "This victory is not just mine. It is a victory for everyone who fought for their rights. I hope this case will be a lesson to other companies and an inspiration to those who have faced injustice. We must not remain silent." Her words were met with applause, and Lisa's face lit up with a smile. She knew her life wasn't back on course yet, but this was the beginning of a new chapter. She now felt stronger than ever and was ready to keep fighting, not only for herself, but for others as well. Several months passed after the trial ended. Lisa was still adjusting to the fact that her life had changed. She was no longer working as a flight attendant, but now she had a completely different goal. The court case, her public appearance, and the whole story had opened doors in front of her that she never thought possible. After the trial, Lisa received an offer to join a leading workers' rights organization. She was asked to lead a project aimed at combating discrimination in the corporate environment. The idea scared her, but it also inspired her. She knew what it was like to be broken by the system, and now she wanted to help others avoid the pain she had gone through. Her first speech at her new place of work was in front of an audience of hundreds of people. They were representatives of various industries, from the restaurant business to aviation. Lisa told her story, but not as a tragedy, but as a way of overcoming it. "I was standing on the edge of a precipice, thinking all was lost," she said. "But I realized that each of us can be a voice for those who are silenced. We don't have to accept injustice. If I could find my way, so can you." The hall exploded with applause. Lisa felt for the first time that her words really inspired people. In an unexpected twist, she received an offer from Elon Musk. He offered her to become part of his team to develop a program that would help large corporations implement inclusive practices. Lisa didn't immediately agree. She found it hard to believe that the man who had indirectly caused her dismissal was now willing to entrust her with such an important task. But after a few meetings, she realized that Musk was really serious. Working with his team was not only a professional challenge, but also a new opportunity for her to prove to herself that she could do more. Her idea to create a special educational platform for company employees to understand and prevent discrimination was approved. The platform is called Equal Sky. Lisa also began writing a book. It was not just an autobiography, but a story about fighting systemic injustice. Her goal was simple: to inspire others not to be afraid to speak up and demand justice. The book became a bestseller, its launches drawing huge audiences. Lisa, who once sat in her small apartment in fear, now traveled the world speaking to people who saw her as an example of resilience. One of the most touching moments for Lisa was the evening she came home from another event and found a message in her mailbox. It was a letter from one of the flight attendants she worked with. "Lisa, you changed my life. Because of you, I was able to come out of the shadows and tell my story. Thank you for your bravery." Tears came to her eyes. She knew she had made the right choice. Lisa was now living a new life. She was no longer the confused woman who had lost everything because of injustice. Her journey had been full of pain, but it had led her to become a voice for those who were afraid to speak up. Her new chapter wasn't just about coming back to life, it was about creating something more. Lisa stared out the window of her new office, looking out over the city that had once been her trap and now was the place for a new mission. She smiled, knowing there was still a lot of work ahead, but now she wasn't afraid. She knew now that the power was always in her hands. If this story touched you, if you saw it as an example of fighting injustice and fortitude, leave your opinion in the comments. Share what you think about how a person can overcome pain and turn it into strength to help others. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel so you don't miss other inspiring stories, and be sure to share this video with your friends and acquaintances. Perhaps this very story will help someone find their way to justice and a new life. Thank you for watching and supporting.